the battlefield no one talks about. I need to tell you something I have never told anyone. Not my pastor, not my closest friend, not the people who sit beside me in church on Sunday mornings, and who, if you asked them, would probably describe me as someone who has his spiritual life reasonably together. What I need to tell you happened inside my own head, in the dark, at 3 in the morning, for most of my adult life. And the reason I never told anyone is that I did not have language for it. I did not understand what was happening. I thought it was simply who I was. I thought the voice in my head was mine. I was wrong about that. And discovering I was wrong about it changed everything. Stay with me. What I am about to share may be the most important thing you hear this week, because I suspect the war I was losing in secret is the same war you are fighting right now, and I suspect, like me, you have never once talked about it out loud. My name is Jonathan Turner. I am 39 years old. I manage records for a county administrative office, which means I spend my days making sure information is organized, accurate, and retrievable. I am good at my job. I am reliable. I show up on time. I attend church on Sunday mornings with the consistency of someone who understands that showing up matters. I pray before meals and before sleep. I volunteer twice a month at a food pantry on the west side of town, and when I do it, I mean it, not as performance, but as genuine practice. From the outside, I have been told more than once, I look like a man who has figured something out. But here is what nobody saw. Here is the conversation that happened every single night after the lights went off and the reasonable distractions of the day finally fell away. In that conversation, I was not the composed and reliable man the daylight version of me appeared to be. I was someone smaller, someone more frightened, someone who replayed failures from years ago with the obsessive precision of a man who believed that if he examined them from enough angles, he might finally arrive at a verdict that let him rest. I was a man who ran worst-case scenarios for situations that had not happened and might never happen, with the exhausting thoroughness of someone who had confused worry with preparation. I was a man who, despite everything I knew about grace and mercy and the character of God, still woke at 3 in the morning convinced in some deep and inarticulate way that I was not quite enough, and that eventually everyone around me was going to figure that out. I never talked about this. I had no language for it. It was simply the weather inside my head, and like weather I had come to accept it as something that arrived and departed on its own schedule, outside my control and largely outside my responsibility. I was managing my outer life with reasonable success. My inner life I had simply learned to live around. The morning that changed everything began not with a revelation, but with a single sentence my friend Robert said in a diner. Robert is the kind of friend I have known since college. The kind you can go 6 months without seeing and then pick up exactly where you left off. He had been going through a difficult season, the details of which I will keep private, and I was listening the way I have learned to listen, which is fully and without preparing what I am going to say next. At some point he said, almost as an aside, I think the reason I keep ending up in the same place is that I never changed what was happening in here. He tapped his temple twice with one finger. I changed everything on the outside. New job, new city, better habits, still the same thoughts, still the same voice telling me the same things it always told me. He paused. I think that voice is the actual problem. I did not have my journal with me. I wrote nothing down, but I held that sentence for the rest of the day, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight and its edges. The voice is the actual problem. It had never once occurred to me that my own interior monologue was a thing that could be examined, challenged, or deliberately changed. I had always thought of it as simply myself, the private, unedited version of who I was. It had not occurred to me that a significant portion of what I accepted as my own authentic inner voice might in fact be something I had been handed, something I absorbed without choosing, something I had never actually agreed to believe, but had simply stopped questioning somewhere along the way. I went home that evening, and I opened my Bible in a way that felt genuinely different from the way I usually open it. I was not looking for comfort or confirmation. I was looking for something specific. I wanted to know what the text actually said about the mind, about thoughts, about the interior life that nobody else could see. What I found stopped me in a way I had not been stopped in years. 2 Corinthians, chapter 10, verses 4 and 5. Paul writes about demolishing arguments and pretensions that set themselves up against the knowledge of God, and taking captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Every thought, not the thoughts that feel obviously dangerous. Every thought. The word he uses is not monitor or evaluate or reflect upon. It is take captive. Military language. Active, aggressive, deliberate. The image is of a soldier not passively observing what passes through the territory, but actively apprehending it, examining it, deciding what it is and whether it is allowed to stay. I had read that passage before. I had heard it preached, but I had always received it as metaphor, as poetic language for a general orientation toward righteousness. Sitting at my oak desk that night, reading it again slowly, I understood it differently. I understood it as instruction, as a specific, practical, demanding discipline I had never once actually practiced the way it described. I began the next morning to try. The first thing I discovered was that trying to observe your own thoughts is significantly harder than it sounds. My mind did not want to be watched. It slipped and slid and changed the subject and offered diversions with the practiced ease of someone who has spent decades perfecting the art of misdirection. I would sit quietly for 10 minutes intending to observe what I was thinking and find, at the end of those 10 minutes, that I had spent them thinking about whether I was doing it correctly, which was itself a thought I had not chosen, but had simply found myself inside of. My interior life had been running on autopilot for so long that the very attempt to take the controls felt foreign and slightly absurd. But I kept at it. I started keeping a second journal, separate from the one I use for observations about the world outside. I called this one, privately, the interior record. Each morning before anything else, I would sit at my desk and write down, without editing, the first thoughts that arrived. Not the performed thoughts. Not the ones I would share in conversation or pray out loud. The actual thoughts. The ones with sharp edges. The recurring characters who showed up reliably to remind me of my failures. The recurring fears that wore disguises so convincing I had spent years mistaking them for wisdom. What I found in those pages disturbed me in a way that was also clarifying. There were thoughts in there I had been carrying for 20 years without ever naming them. Thoughts that had been quietly shaping my decisions, my relationships, my sense of what was possible for me, without my ever having consciously agreed to give them that authority. There was one in particular that said, "You are the kind of person things do not ultimately work out for." I do not know where it came from. I cannot trace it to a single event or a single person. It had simply been there, in the background, a quiet constant, and because I had never looked at it directly, I had never thought to ask whether it was actually true or whether I had simply inherited it from somewhere and never returned it. I thought about Eve in the Garden of Eden. I had heard that story hundreds of times, enough times that the familiarity of it had smoothed over its actual strangeness. But reading it with fresh attention, I noticed something I had never paused over before. The serpent did not begin with a command. It did not announce itself. It began with a question. Did God really say? For words. A small, seemingly reasonable inquiry. Not a declaration of war. Not an obvious assault. Just a seed of doubt, placed carefully at exactly the right angle in exactly the right soil. And Eve was not stupid or faithless or particularly careless. She simply did not recognize what was happening. She engaged with the thought as though it were a legitimate question deserving a genuine answer, rather than a strategic manipulation designed to produce a specific outcome. By the time she understood the difference, the damage was complete. I wrote about this for 3 consecutive mornings. I wrote, "The enemy does not announce himself. He asks questions. He suggests alternatives. He frames things as reasonable doubt. And because the thoughts he plants arrive in my own voice, in my own cadence, I assume they originate with me." And then I wrote the question that kept me awake. How many of my deepest beliefs about myself arrived this way? How many of my most limiting convictions were not conclusions I reached through honest reflection, but suggestions I accepted without examining, because they arrived quietly and seemed to belong? I developed, over the weeks that followed, a practice I still use every morning. When a thought arrives, particularly a recurring one, particularly one carrying strong emotional weight, I ask it 3 questions. First, is this thought consistent with what Scripture says is true? Second, Does this thought produce the fruit of the Spirit that Paul describes in Galatians chapter 5, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? Or does it produce the opposite? Third, if I follow this thought to its logical end and act on what it tells me, where exactly does it lead? These are not quick questions. They require sitting with a thought long enough to actually look at it, and that is uncomfortable, because the thoughts that most need examining are precisely the ones that most resist examination. The thought, "you are not enough," does not want to be held up to the light and compared against what God says about the people He has made. Because when it is held up to that light, it begins to lose its authority almost immediately. It knows this, so it has spent years developing a talent for staying in the background where it cannot be questioned. I thought deeply during this period about Job, a man who lost everything: his children, his wealth, his health, the sympathy of his wife, the confident explanations of his friends. A man who argued with God in language so raw and direct that it still makes some readers uncomfortable now, thousands of years later. What I noticed, reading Job carefully for the first time with this particular attention, was not the arguing, but what the arguing was rooted in. Job's mind was not peaceful. He said so plainly and repeatedly. He was in agony, turning his situation over and over, unable to arrive at an explanation that satisfied him. And yet through all of that interior darkness, he held on to one thing with both hands. He held on to the conviction that God was present. Not comfortable, not explainable, not currently making any sense, but present. I know that my Redeemer lives. He said that in chapter 19, while everything was still terrible and nothing had been restored. He did not wait for the circumstances to change before allowing himself to hold the conviction. He held it while the circumstances remained unchanged. That is not resignation. That is an act of the mind. A deliberate, costly, muscular act of choosing what to believe in the absence of the evidence you might ordinarily expect to require. I tried this. I tried it specifically on my recurring 3 in the morning conviction that I was fundamentally insufficient. I tried holding alongside that conviction the counter-conviction from Isaiah 54, where God says, "I have called you and you are mine." And from Romans chapter 8, where Paul writes that nothing in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. I tried holding these things at the same time. The counter-conviction felt thin and abstract at first against the thick, bodily certainty of the insufficiency thought. The insufficiency thought had 20 years of residence in me. It had roots. It had history. It knew my specific details and could produce personalized evidence on demand. The counter-conviction felt borrowed, like something that might be true in general, but somehow did not fully apply to the specific case of me. I wrote about this honestly. The problem is not that I disbelieve the promises. The problem is that I do not believe they apply to me individually. I believe God's love is large in the abstract. I have much more difficulty believing it is aimed at me personally, the way a flashlight is aimed rather than the way a floodlight is simply on. I sat with that for a long time. Then I wrote about Peter. After the denial, after the courtyard, and the fire, and the rooster, and the 3 times. When Jesus looked at him across the crowd, Peter did not see general mercy available to anyone who qualified. He saw the specific, named, personal face of the one he had failed most completely. The restoration that came later was not general either. Jesus asked him 3 times, once for each denial. "Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my lambs. Do you love me?" It was surgical. It was specific. It was aimed precisely at the wound. I wrote, that is how I need to receive the promises. Not as general truths floating at altitude. As specific, aimed things. Aimed at the exact thought. At the exact place where I stopped believing. There was a particular morning, somewhere in the 3rd month of what I had come to think of as my interior renovation, when a thought arrived that I had been carrying for as long as I could remember. Your faith is not real. What you call faith is just comfort-seeking. If God were not convenient for you, you would not believe. I had heard this thought many times. I had always handled it the way you handle a suspicious smell in a room, by moving to a different room. This morning I stayed. I asked it the 3 questions. I was honest about the first one. Yes, There were elements of my faith that involved comfort-seeking, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But for the second question, I noticed that this thought arrived with a cold, prosecutorial precision that felt less like genuine inquiry and more like a case being built. It selected evidence and discarded counter-evidence with the efficiency of someone who had already decided the verdict. A genuine question pursues truth wherever truth leads. This thought did not pursue truth. It pursued a specific conclusion. And for the third question, where did it lead? It led to the paralysis of a man who could not trust his own spiritual experience and therefore could not act on it, and who without the capacity to act would gradually stop believing anything at all. I wrote, "This thought wants me to doubt the only framework through which I have access to genuine peace. It arrives dressed as intellectual honesty, but it is not in the service of truth. It is in the service of my defeat." I thought about Joseph, thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold to slave traders, carried to Egypt, falsely accused, imprisoned. Years of unjust suffering. Years of silence from the God who had given him the dreams that started all the trouble in the first place. And through all of that, the text describes Joseph working with complete faithfulness in whatever circumstance he finds himself. Not because the circumstances are fair. They are not. Not because God has explained anything. He is not. But because something in Joseph's interior life has been settled in a direction that external events cannot fully redirect. When Potiphar's wife reaches for him, he does not deliberate. He does not calculate. He simply runs. The decision had already been made, somewhere much deeper than the moment of temptation, in the long interior work of a man who knows what he is and trusts that knowledge enough to act on it without thinking about it. I wrote, "The battle with temptation is mostly over before the moment of temptation arrives. It is won or lost in the ordinary minutes of an ordinary day when nothing dramatic is happening and the only thing being formed is the direction in which the mind habitually turns when it is not being told what to do." I thought about Mary Magdalene, a woman from whom 7 demons had been cast out. 7, a number of completeness. Whatever had occupied her interior life before the encounter with Jesus, it had been occupied at every level by something that was not her. And after the encounter, she became one of the most consistently present figures in the gospel accounts. There at the cross when the disciples fled. There at the tomb before dawn. The first person to whom the risen Jesus appeared. The transformation that happened in her mind when she encountered him produced a devotion that was absolute and unconditional. Not because her circumstances improved, but because what occupied her mind had changed completely. And from that changed occupation, everything else followed. I wrote, "Real transformation does not begin at the level of behavior. It begins at the level of what the mind holds, what it returns to, what it treats as reliable. When the occupants of the mind change, the behavior changes the way water changes direction when you change the shape of the ground it moves across. Not by force, by nature." I began to pray differently during this period. Not longer, not more formally, with a different quality of attention. I had always prayed in words, moving through topics with the organized efficiency of a man who understood there was a great deal to cover. I began to pray more slowly. I began to bring into the prayer the specific thoughts that had been occupying me, the named fears, the recurring conviction about my insufficiency, the questions I had carried for years without voicing, and to hold them up explicitly before God, not to have them immediately resolved, but to allow them to be seen by the one witness whose perception of them was both complete and entirely without agenda. I discovered that this slower, less organized prayer produced something the previous kind had not reliably produced. It produced the peace Paul describes in Philippians 4 as passing all understanding. A peace that does not depend on the circumstances being resolved, that does not require the difficult thoughts to have stopped arriving, but that is present anyway, underneath everything, steadier than the thoughts, not a feeling but a foundation. I thought often about Moses on the mountaintop, while Joshua fought in the valley below. Moses not fighting, not advising, standing with his arms raised, or sitting when standing was no longer possible, simply holding. And when his hands were lifted, Israel prevailed. When his hands fell, Amalek prevailed. Until Aaron and Hur stood beside him, and held his arm steady until sunset and the battle was finished. I wrote, "Intercession is holding the reality of another person's situation up before God with sustained and deliberate attention. It is the mind doing work that looks from the outside like nothing at all." Moses was not fighting. He was holding. And the holding was the most consequential work being done on that entire mountain. I began to hold the people around me this way, not to think about them with concern or plan my interventions, just to hold them. Robert, with his difficult season and his unchanged thoughts. A colleague at work who had become brittle in ways she was not fully aware of. My neighbor whose wife had died and who answered his door now with the expression of a man who was physically present and everywhere else absent. I held each of them with open hands, trusting that God could work in the space that the attention opened even when I could not see what was happening there. The greatest changes that happened in me over the months that followed were not visible in the large things. My life looked largely the same from the outside. Same job, same modest house, same oak desk and lamp and coffee maker I have trusted for years. But the quality of the 3 in the morning quiet had changed. That silence, which had always been the place where the unmanaged interior life ran its tests without supervision, had become something different. Not peaceful in the way of absence, peaceful in the way of presence. Not the silence of nothing being there, but the silence of someone being in the room with you, steady and unhurried, and entirely without the intention of leaving. I wrote, near the end of the interior record, a sentence I had not planned. I spent most of my life managing the interior by avoiding the rooms I did not want to enter. I moved the furniture to block the doors. What I was missing was that God was already in the rooms I had been avoiding. He had been there the whole time, waiting, not accusing me of the avoidance, just present, inside the very territory I was afraid to fully enter, ready to work the moment I was willing to walk all the way in. I also discovered, toward the end of those 6 months, that the work of the mind is not only defensive. I had started thinking of it primarily as protection, as building walls against the thoughts that damaged me. But sitting with Philippians 4 one morning, reading Paul's instruction to think about whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, I understood that the mind oriented toward God is not only pushing harmful things out. It is actively drawing in, dwelling on, returning again and again to things that are true and beautiful. The word carries the weight of sustained attention, not a glance, a dwelling, a choosing to stay with something long enough to be shaped by it. I began practicing grateful inventory each morning, not in the general sense of acknowledging that I had much to be grateful for, which is easy and costs nothing, in the specific sense of naming, out loud, the actual particular things in my actual particular life that were true and noble and lovely that day. Because gratitude, I learned, is not a feeling that arrives when circumstances are favorable. It is a practice that makes something different of circumstances regardless of whether they are favorable. I thought about the 10 lepers in Luke chapter 17. 10 healed, 1 returning to give thanks. And Jesus saying to that one, and to no one else in that story, "Your faith has made you well." The other 9 had been healed. This one had been made well in a way that went deeper than the healing. The difference was the returning, the naming, the refusing to let the extraordinary pass through unacknowledged. I closed my second journal on the 183rd morning of the interior renovation, not because I had finished, because it was full. I set it beside the first journal and looked at them both. The first full of observations about the world outside me. The second full of observations about the world inside me. The second, I understood clearly, was the more important record, not because the outer world is less real, but because the inner world is the place from which I meet everything in the outer world, and the quality of that meeting determines, in ways I spent 40 years not fully understanding, the quality of everything else. I opened a third journal. At the top of the first page, I wrote the date. Beneath it, I wrote the verse from John chapter 15, where Jesus says, "Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself, unless it abides in the vine, neither can you, unless you abide in me." I had read the word abide 100 times. I understood now what it meant. Stay, remain, Do not move to the next thing before you have fully inhabited this thing. The quality of connection that comes not from visiting, but from living in. Not from acknowledging, but from dwelling. Not from believing in the abstract, but from maintaining, daily and deliberately, the kind of interior alignment that makes the presence of God the actual atmosphere in which your thoughts breathe. I wrote beneath the verse, "This is the work, not the work anyone else can see, not the work that produces visible results in the short term. The work of the mind turned toward God, held there, kept there, returned there when it wanders, shaped slowly over years into the kind of mind from which a faithful life flows as naturally as fruit from a branch that has not been cut off. This is the work." Outside my window, the first light of morning was beginning its slow approach. A bird somewhere in the tree near the window. The neighborhood still mostly asleep. I sat at my oak desk under my lamp and kept the door open between my mind and God and waited in that openness for whatever the day was going to bring. I want to say something to you directly before I close. The war I was losing in secret for 20 years was not a war about behavior. It was a war about what I believed in the dark, when no one was watching, when the performed self had gone to sleep and the actual self was left alone with the actual thoughts. I changed a great deal on the outside over those 20 years. The interior stayed largely the same because I had never once really looked at it. I had managed it by avoidance, by keeping busy, by moving to a different room when the smell got bad. What changed everything was not a dramatic event. It was a small practice, done daily, in the quiet before the world started its noise. Sit with the thoughts. Name them. Hold them up. Ask them where they came from and where they lead. Measure them against what is actually true. Fill the renovated space deliberately with what is noble and right and lovely. Hold the people you love in open hands before the God who loves them more than you do. Abide. I am still at my desk every morning. Journal open. Coffee steaming. The voice in my head is not the same voice it used to be. Not because the enemy stopped trying, but because I stopped letting the attempts go unexamined. Because I learned, slowly and with a great deal of failure along the way, to take captive what arrived uninvited and to fill the space it left with what was true. The territory of your mind is the most important ground you will ever be asked to tend. God is already in the rooms you have been afraid to enter. He has been there the whole time. The question is only whether you are ready to go all the way in and let him begin. I can tell you from the other side of that decision, it is worth it. Every single morning, it is worth it.